Hi everyone, my name's Andre. Welcome to Med School EU. And the topic of today's video is going to be the nervous system. And this is something we talked about in our animal tissues unit. However, we're going to revisit this in greater detail and talk about the anatomy and physiology in humans on the nervous system. So the first thing I'm going to discuss is the organization of the nervous system, how it is organized, and what are the names of the different types of nervous systems as they're divided into several different types. So first we got at the very top of the hierarchy, we got of course the nervous system. If we are following downwards, it breaks off into two separate systems. It's called the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system I'm going to label here because it divides into two other branches. So it's called central nervous system. I'm just going to label it as CNS. And we got the peripheral nervous system that is going to be labeled as PNS. So that's the two subdivisions of the greater nervous system altogether. Now the peripheral nervous system is something that is outside the spinal cord and the brain. So the brain is considered to be the central nervous system. That's the commands that are given to the entire body, and then those commands are passed on by the peripheral nervous system that is situated in the limbs, in the in your organs, in your internal body, except for the spinal cord as well as the brain. And so the central nervous system has two other subdivisions which we just mentioned. It would be the brain and the spinal cord. So the peripheral nervous system has two other subdivisions. One is called autonomic nervous system, and I'm going to label it here ANS. And the other one is called somatic nervous system. I'm going to discuss both in briefly. So somatic nervous system, SNS. The autonomic nervous system is the nervous system that is controlled automatically by our brain and the spinal cord. So this nervous system is controlled without us being aware of it. And so it has two subdivisions. It's got the parasympathetic nervous system and sympathetic nervous systems. So parasympathetic is involved with rest and digest. So it's involved with slowing down your body so it does not waste resources. It's all about concentrating the energy. And sympathetic nervous system is involved in fight or flight response. So it is involved in doing the work, expanding energy in times of stress. So if there's something physical that's going on or something that's internal, that will be activated by the sympathetic nervous system. That's the thing that raises your heart rate, raises your breathing in case you're doing exercise. And then once you stop exercising, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, and it would regulate it in order to slow down the heart rate, because you no longer need your heart to be putting out a bigger cardiac output when you're resting 30 minutes after your workout or whatever happens to be. So the parasympathetic system is extremely important. Just like the sympathetic, they play a role of an equilibrium system. So when you are exercising, it does not mean the parasympathetic system is not involved anymore. It means that it's involved a lot less than the sympathetic system. So it forms sort of an equilibrium. However, when the demands of the body are changed, that's when the equilibrium is going to shift towards sympathetic, or it will shift toward parasympathetic depending on what the body is doing and what the environment is like. Finally, from the somatic nervous system, SNS, so it's somatic. The somatic nervous system is voluntary. So this system is something that we can control. It's something that we are aware of, and that's more involved in terms of your movement of your limbs, your muscles. You have complete control of your skeletal muscle in most areas of the body. And so the automatic nervous system is not going to be controlling any of that, because you are in complete awareness and control of when the muscle is going to contract, which muscle will contract, and how you're going to move. That is all controlled by the somatic nervous system. It is voluntary. whereas the autonomic nervous system is involuntary. Now it is broken down into two segments. It is called sensory and motor. Moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about the neuron anatomy, and this is something that I brought up earlier in our previous lectures. However, here I wanted to go a little bit further detail about this. So first of all, the part that's right in the center here with the light blue, that is the nucleus of our cell. So of course, this is anatomy of a neuron. A neuron is the basic unit of the nervous system. So it is the single cell, and these cells could be very long or they could be shorter. However, they can range depending on which type of neuron this is. So they're composed of this nucleus that's in the middle of the cell body. So this entire thing here is the cell body. And that's the kind of tree-like circle over here. And then these projections that are sticking out of it, they are called dendrites. So I'll label it here. And these dendrites, they're responsible for receiving signal from either environmental stimuli that's on the surface of the skin, or maybe from pressures onto the skin, or they are responsible for receiving signal from other neurons that are interconnected to them. And I'll talk about what that means. Now also, it's important to note that the cytoplasm of these neurons, they have these various structures just like a regular cell would. And the cytoplasm contains mitochondria, so many mitochondria that would provide energy for the cell, and they would have an extensive rough endoplasmic reticulum, rough ER. And it's extensive. It is typically more complex than the regular cell that we've discussed previously. Now if we take a look at the long projection that comes off the cell body, it is called the axon. And we've talked about the axon a little bit before. So it's the axon that goes all along here. Now all these yellow structures that are around the axon, these ones are called Schwann cells. In between the Schwann cells, there's these little gaps, and all of these gaps, they're going to be called nodes of Ranvier. These are the primary structures of the axon. The Schwann cells, they provide insulation for the axon in order to have the signal passed on much quicker. As you might imagine, the neuron is providing signals, electrical signals, that is basically a means of communication between one part of the body and another part of the body. So the brain is going to communicate with your bicep muscle in order to raise your arm or raise your forearm and flex the muscle, and it's going to be done almost instantaneously. And the reason for that is because the way it's passed on, these cells, these neurons, are able to pass on the signal extremely fast, in milliseconds. And so this occurs primarily due to these Schwann cells, because the Schwann cells provide insulation, so the electrical signal will be able to jump from one node of Ranvier to the next, instead of going through the entire thing much, much slower. And not every neuron has Schwann cells. Schwann cells have this importance in terms of transmitting signal, so that it is the system in general works very efficiently and very quickly. Now the ends of the axon here, and these projections kind of look like the dendrites, these are called terminal branches. And these terminal branches typically connect to the dendrites or other parts of the body. So they could connect to dendrites of another neuron, and the signal will be passed on this way. And if they do, then they form these synaptic knobs, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. And before we move on, I wanted to come back to this Schwann cell, just to kind of provide a better anatomy of it, so you could imagine what these Schwann cells look like. Because the insulation that they provide, they're actually cells. They're not some material that's around the axon that's doing this. They're actual cells that do their specialized function. So here, the center of it, this is basically a cross section of the axon that we just saw previously. So this would be the axon, and this is the cross section of it. And here, this spiral structure is called Schwann cell. And this would be the body, the cell body, or the nucleus here. And this bigger yellow structure, this would be the cell body of the Schwann cell. So this is the way it is structured, and as you can see, it would provide this sort of insulation for the axon so that the electrical signal cannot escape, and it would have to jump over and really transmit much faster through that part of the axon. Next, I wanted to revisit the concept of the types of neurons. So we're going to take a look at the three different structures, the three different primary types of neurons. Of course, there's a couple of other subsections, but they all kind of fall into these three categories. And so we have our motor neuron up at the top here. So this is going to be the motor neuron, and you can note how they're shaped. The reason why the cell body and the dendrites are located in this sort of orientation is because the cell body of the motor neuron lies within the spinal cord or the brain. So it lies within the central nervous system. This is where this cell body and the dendrites are located, and so that they're in this sort of orientation. And then the nucleus of the neuron is always in its cell body, and often dark specks can be seen in the cytoplasm if you're looking through the microscope. And typically these axons of the motor neuron tend to be extremely long. They tend to run very long distances because their cell body is located in the spinal cord typically, and its axon is going to be running all the way up to your toes, for example, in terms of stimulation of the muscles in the toes. So you can imagine how long this cell could really be, because the axon is still part of this one single cell, and then these terminal ends are going to be attached to the receptors on the skeletal muscle, which will activate the muscle and will cause contraction. So the motor neuron in summary transmits impulses from the central nervous system to the effector. Now if we're looking at the sensory neuron, it transmits impulses from receptors to the central nervous system. And this is what I've mentioned in the previous slide. The correlation between sensory and motor neuron is that the sensory is going to sense any stimuli coming from the environment or from the body itself, and then it's going to transmit that impulse to the central nervous system, and the central nervous system will give a command to the effector through the motor neuron. That's the kind of relationship. It's a circular path that this goes on to. And as you can see, the sensory neuron, because this would be labeled as the sensory, and the sensory neuron has a different structure than the motor neuron. Its cell body is going to lie somewhere in the middle of the axon, and so it is just important to note that it's going to have this different structure. Now, if we're talking about the inner neuron, it's also called the relay or the connector neurons. So the inner neuron's function is to transmit impulses from the sensory neuron, so from the impulse from the environment, to the motor neuron. And so these would be located in the central nervous system. So there's this relationship going on. First, you get a signal coming from the environment that will be taken up by the sensory neuron and brought to the central nervous system. From the central nervous system, it will be passed on around to the motor neuron, and from the motor neuron in the central nervous system, which is where the cell body lies, it will go to the effector. And the final thing I wanted to talk about today is called the reflex arc, and this is something I briefly mentioned previously in our one of our first videos on this unit. However, I wanted to again talk about this concept and give a little bit more detail to provide a better understanding of it. And so the reflex arc, the way it really works, I used previously the example of the hot stove. So when you put your hand on the hot stove by accident and you feel your hand is gonna burn, but before you get the sense that the hand is burning, your hand has already come off. So it will automatically pull away before you even realize it was hot. And then maybe a second later you will realize, oh no, wow, that was really hot. So the way this works is that once you have a stimuli that goes, and as you can see here, there's a reception for pain. So you get pain in the site of your finger, and the way you get a response is you get two responses. One that goes to the spinal cord and one that goes further to the brain. Of course, to the brain is going to travel further, so it's going to take a longer time. There's going to be more connections between neurons and the inner neurons and so on. And it's just going to take a longer time to happen. However, when it goes to the spinal cord, there's going to be an automatic reaction for the muscle to activate and to pull back. This is why you're going to pull back before you realize what happened, because it takes a little bit longer for the brain to process things before it can activate the muscle. However, this is really a survival mechanism that we have, and there's all types of different reflexes that we have to keep us alive. For example, when you're tripping, you know, you're walking down the stairs and you slip, so you're going to be tripping. And you catch yourself, but you catch yourself not because you realized you were tripping and then you gave yourself commands on how to catch yourself. This happens automatically because of the action of the spinal cord. And then once you do catch yourself, and you might have saved a bad accident from happening, and that is done by the spinal cord. And only later you realize, yeah, I almost fell. So this is really a survival mechanism for us to be able to activate the muscle before you even realize that there's any harm happening to the body. And so I wanted to again go over some of the anatomy of this reflex arc. So first we have our receptor. Now obviously we just talked about that this would be the sensory neuron. So that would be sensing the pain, the signal, and it's going to be transmitting it to the spinal cord. There's going to be another neuron that will be going off and transmitting it to the brain as well. However, we're just going to be focused on this spinal cord. The part of the spine where this sensory neuron goes is called the dorsal root. That's the part of the spinal cord that this goes to, and it's going to interact. And this would be the cell body of the sensory neuron, because the cell body of the sensory neuron typically lies around either the spinal cord or it's going to lie closer to the receptor. Now the signal is obviously going to be passed on to the intermediate neuron, as we talked about before. This has already reached its central nervous system because the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and the signal is going to be transmitted by the interneuron. So that's the cell body of interneuron, IN, I'm going to label it. So that's right here, right in the center. Now this part here is called white matter, and in the gray matter we have most of the cell bodies. So the cell bodies are typically going to be located in the gray matter of the spinal cord, and in the white matter we're going to have mostly the axons. As you can see, the axon is going to be passing through this white matter part. Now then there's going to be a connection between the interneuron and the motor neuron, and that's going to be the cell body of the motor neuron. Because remember, the cell body of the motor neuron comes off the central nervous system, which is right here. It comes right off the spinal cord, and it's going to follow through the ventral root, and you can you can look up these terms. They're pretty interesting in terms of anatomy when you'll be learning, just to be able to qualify what is the front, what is the back of the body. And they would be labeled with the dorsal and the ventral root. So the motor neuron will be going through this ventral root right here. Instead of the dorsal root, it will be going through this side of the spinal cord, and it will be producing its output, as you can see here on the muscle. So it will be pulling the finger away from harm before you even realize it, which is pretty phenomenal. It is absolutely incredible how the nervous system works, and the speed at which it's able to react to different signals is absolutely fascinating. So we've reached the end of today's video. However, it's not going to be the end of the topic of the nervous system, as it is extremely extensive, and we're just going to cover the tip of the iceberg. And so in the next video, we're going to talk about action potentials. We're going to talk about how the nervous system is stimulated and how signals are transmitted between one neuron and another.